Hi, according to my driver's license, my name is Michael Murphy. As a result of a story that is way off topic for this video, I acquired a stage name of Dr. Alphonse Casper Mabuse about 25 years ago. It started as a joke. Unfortunately, over 25 years, more people came to know me as simply Doc than my real name, so I think I'm going to go with Doc for the rest of the series. What you're watching is an explanatory series of videos about electronic instruments that I have built starting in about 1999. People constantly walk up when there are performances involving these things and ask, what is this? And my reaction is generally to let other performers stammer for a few minutes while I run off to the bathroom. The reason for that is that it is not really a straightforward question as to what they are. Certainly, they are electronic and their purpose is music, so they're electronic instruments. And so it's natural to ask the question, well, are they synthesizers? And in a sense, they most definitely are synthesizers. Under the hood, when I build them, I am using synthesizer technology. I prefer the term Electronium. And I use that term not to be deliberately obscure, but because an electronium is simply a made-up word, and it sort of connotes neither a synthesizer in the classic sense, nor something that I just pulled out of thin air and made up myself. The term, as far as I know it, was coined by a fellow by the name of Raymond Scott in the late 40s and early 50s. If you're unfamiliar with Raymond Scott, I strongly recommend that you Google the name Raymond Scott Electronium and look up his work. It was truly amazing. And he's not very well known because he was working in the commercial realm, and he was very secretive about his work. He was acquainted with the young Robert Moog, who of course went on to become one of the gods in the pantheon of analog synthesis with the Moog synthesizer. But Robert Moog actually worked with Raymond Scott, and Raymond Scott made him sign non-disclosure agreements that were 16 to 20 pages long. He was kind of a victim of his own commercial paranoia because a lot of people only discovered him after his death. But he coined the term Electronium, and basically what he was trying to do with the term was connote an instrument that had a particular sound in the way that a violin has a violin sound. He wanted a word that was new to define the fact that the instruments were new and unique, but he wanted to allude to the fact that they were electronic, which was very new at the time. I think that term fits better than synthesizer or electronic instrument. So I call them Electroniums. It's a fair question to ask, well, what makes them different than a synthesizer? And that's a very arbitrary subject, but I think of synthesizers. My first exposure to them was seeing a Moog synthesizer on television. It was with the Boston Pops Orchestra, and it was the Gershon Kingsley Moog Quartet playing Handel's Water music along with the symphony. And they had the symphony in the background, and then these four guys in dark suits across the front of the stage playing things that looked like telephone switchboards. And as a kid, I watched this and was just absolutely transfixed. And they had keyboards in front of them, and they would play the little motifs on the keyboards, and the sound was something that rocked my world. I never forgot that performance. But in those days, in the Walter/Wendy Carlos switched-on Bach era in the 60s, the notion was that synthesizers were electronic devices that could imitate any instrument in the orchestra or any instrument that existed. That by using different modules, that they could patch them together in combinations like a Lego set for the sound of an instrument, and you could patch up something that sounded like an oboe, or patch up something that sounded like a saxophone or a guitar or a conga drum. So the term synthesis implies that something's synthetic or that's imitative. At this point, I have to take the story back to two of my early mentors, although I never met them, of course, but that was Beebe and Louis Barron. Beebe and Louis, who were married at the time, lived in Greenwich Village in New York, and they were interested in electronic music in the early 50s. And back then, there was no such thing as a synthesizer, so they had to get a lab full of test equipment from Sonic Labs, signal generators and fixed frequency filters, and they just filled a room with this stuff and started hooking it up with their own do-it-yourself circuits and producing sounds and recording everything onto multi-track tape machines, which were also new at the time. And they produced the electronic score for the movie Forbidden Planet, which was another early influence on me. And the work was extremely innovative, and the producer of the film managed to promote the soundtrack well enough that Beebe and Louis were nominated for an Oscar. And the Musicians Union in Los Angeles at the time said, whoa, 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 whoa. These people aren't musicians. They're not in the Musicians Union. And this thing that they're doing is not an instrument, it's just a bunch of electronic equipment. And so you really can't nominate that as a soundtrack or as a music soundtrack competing against real musicians who were writing scores for symphony orchestras. And so the Academy kind of chickened out and just gave them some kind of a nomination for special sonic electronic effects or something like that. But at the time, they didn't even want to recognize sounds that were electronic in origin as music. And I'm sure that a lot of people who've heard these instruments in performance agree with the Musicians Union at the time, because I do occasionally get asked, so you really think this is music? And in a word, yes. To me, it is music. technology is transparent to me after working with this stuff for 45 years. But I realize that when people see it, it conjures an image of science fiction, high tech, and I have to cop to that. I have been coy in the past and told people, oh no, this is exactly the way that I imagined it. But the fact of the matter is that when I build these circuits, I have to house them in something. They have to look like something. They have to present me with a surface that I can interact with when I play them. And so the way they look is essentially an utter visual caprice on my part. They just look this way because I want them to, and I really wasn't thinking of them as visual objects other than to interact with an audience. They were meant simply to interact with me, and I was very flattered when artists would come to the show and say, oh, that's beautiful. And I was kind of like, it is? Because it's really kind of messy, and the artists were always pretty insistent that they had some visual value. And of course, hearing this, especially when I started doing this in earnest around 1999, of course it influenced me, and I thought, well, what am I going to put this next circuit in? I tend to use found objects for housing a lot, simply because it saves me the trouble of having, it's hard enough building the circuits, and so I'm not looking to add to the workload by building enclosures. And the other aspect of it is I always felt that the classic electronic synthesizer, the analog modular look, was a bit sterile. They always looked to me like it was test equipment. It looks like test equipment. And I am an engineer, primarily software, in how I make my livelihood, and I'm around that stuff all the time, and I wanted something that was a little different than that. And another thing that you may notice in the entire series is that the knobs and controls on these objects are in general not labeled. You can see on this one that I'm going to talk about in another segment that the knobs are placed on a kind of an ersatz Renaissance map on a wooden box. And the reason, and of course people look at this spray of knobs completely unlabeled on a surface, and they're like, you must be nuts, which is another fair cop. But there is a reason for me not to label knobs, and that is that it forces me to learn the instrument. And in my defense, I will point out that when you take your violin out of the case, there is nothing on the violin that says put finger here for C sharp. What you have to learn to play it by ear. You have to learn that when you put your finger there on the violin, this sound comes out, and there's a feedback loop. The sound comes out and goes in your ear, and it tells your muscles that's a C sharp, or that's almost a C sharp and I need to move up a little, or that's almost a C sharp and I want to leave it there because it's not, because I don't want it to be exactly in tune. That cognitive feedback loop is crucial to my process. When I play these things, it is crucial that I hear every nuance of what's coming out of them. And I learn to associate the changes in the sound and the macro structures of the piece that I'm playing. I've learned to associate all those attributes with the muscle movements of what gets touched on the playing surface. And so that's why there are very few, if any, legends or labels on the devices that you're going to see in this series. So there's an old Latin phrase that is nihil sub sole novum. Nothing is new under the sun. And one disclaimer I want to make in the early going in this series is that the notion of originality in this field is very problematic. And so I want to make sure that even though I believe that the instruments in my work are unique, I don't claim to have invented things. And it's another reason that I started calling them Electroniums. It was a reminder to myself that Raymond Scott was doing innovative work like this in the early 50s, you know, just a little before I was born. And so I want to stress that that the ideas and the devices are not things that I consider myself the inventor or originator of. If anything, I discovered the technology that is in here. And of course, I'm very open to happy accidents, and there have been thousands of them in the process of developing and building them. And when I find one of those happy accidents, I spray it in lacquer and try to freeze it in circuitry and get it under the hood as quickly as I can. And in that sense, I want to point out that I have enjoyed the generosity of some very important and very generous mentors in my life. And one of the principal ones is a fellow by the name of Grant Richter, who founded the Wired Synthesizer Company in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And because I talk about my Electroniums as, my Electronium work as having begun in 1999, which is also the year that I went up with a bunch of analog synthesizers in the back seat of my car to trade with a guy that I had met on this new thing called the internet for some synthesizers that he was building. And Grant answered the door on the Saturday before Easter, and the rest, as they say, is history. We really resonated with one another, and he is a largely self-taught electrical engineer, but he was very legitimate. I am definitely not a legitimate electrical engineer. I do this kind of thing, whereas Grant had worked in the industry designing temperature controls for pizza ovens and for the mechanism that locked the dome in place on the Astrodome. So he had there was a little more responsibility in his job than mine. But he had at the time I met him, retired from his professional work and decided he was going into this full time. He really took me under his wing and refined my knowledge and encouraged me to do things that were not orthodox electronic engineering. That's an important concept in my work, because I do, even though there are synthesizer-like components in these things, I use a lot of these designs in what the orthodoxy would call wrong. I mess with the technology. And before I go too far down that road, I also need to mention the enormous influence of a musician and instrument builder here in my hometown of St. Louis, Missouri. He spent 4 decades as principal percussionist in the St. Louis Symphony, and that's Rich O'Donnell. I could do an entire hour just on Rich's curriculum vitae, but suffice to say that that Rich provided not only an enormous well of technical knowledge to me. I think one of the most important aspects of Rich's influence on this work is that Rich is absolutely fearless about technology. If Rich wants to hear what a different shaped timpani is, he learned what he needed to know to dig a sand pit in his backyard and cast the bronze himself to check that technology out. That kind of fearlessness was a real inspiration to me, not to worry about whether I was doing things right or doing things the way they'd always been done, but just to roll up my sleeves, burn my fingers on the soldering iron, and get something done. And that push, that kick, was very important to the work. So I want to say that I definitely am standing on the shoulders of 2 giants in my oeuvre. And and while I'm still talking in the overview, I want to say a word about the music. Now, in these videos, you will hear the Electroniums themselves, and I will not be trying to do a performance per se on them. I'll mostly be illustrating techniques in the electronic gestures that they make. So it will be more demonstration than performance. But you will get an idea of what they sound like, and consequently what you would hear if you came to a performance in which I was performing on these instruments. And as I mentioned before, it's a legitimate question to say, so you think this is music? And my answer is yes. A concept that will come up constantly in these demonstrations is patterns. Music is sound arranged in patterns. And in my mind, that is about as tight as the definition needs to be. The human mind looks for patterns. And there's a concept called entraining, where you see something over and over and over, and your brain reacts to this. Your brain at first focuses on the pattern and says, wait a minute, I think I heard that before. Let me hear that again. Yeah, I heard that before. Oh yeah, yeah, I heard that before. Oh yeah. That's, I've definitely heard that before. Yep, there it is. There's that old thing that I've been listening to. Yep, that's it. And eventually your brain says, oh my God, here it comes again. And then your brain starts to not hear it because it's like, oh, this again. Especially, if there's like an annoying noise that just keeps repeating in the background. People who live close to Niagara Falls, even though their hearing is just fine, claim they do not hear them at all anymore. And this psychoacoustic phenomenon is essentially what music exploits, because in classical music, the old familiar sonata allegro form that you learn about in music theory class, with the 3 sections of exposition of theme, development, and recapitulation. Well, the exposition of theme is, here's a pattern, a melody, da 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 da. There you go. Then in the development, it's like, well, here's the same pattern, but I'm going to change it up a little, just a little. I'm going to nudge it toward one key center or another, or change the major-minor tonality. And then there's the recapitulation. And that is in the development. Now we've taken the theme and we've twisted it into all these different shapes. Maybe even introduced a couple of extra themes and combined them. And we've basically been moving the shells around to confuse you a little bit. And then here at the end, we're going to have the recapitulation. And we're going to bring that theme back in out of all of this complexity that we built up, and your brain is going to go, aha, I remember that from the first section. And human beings just love to be reunited with an old friend like that. It sparks an emotional reaction. And that arc of exposition, development, and recapitulation is not in any way limited to music that's composed of the do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do diatonic notes of Western music. I mean, it can apply to flipping through television channels. And of course, getting back to nothing new being under the sun, in the 40s, John Cage put a guy on a stage with a radio and with some instructions for what to do when tuning the radio, and that was the musical composition. And naturally, I mean, there were strong reactions on both sides. I mean, a lot of people immediately regarded this as a joke, that Cage was a charlatan, and Cage was anything but a charlatan. He took it very, very seriously, and he was very vociferous about defending himself in that sense. And then other people regarded it as a work, as groundbreaking genius, that to try to get the audience to think of the patterns they're hearing just walking down a street, of imposing a paradigm of art on the sounds that they encounter just in normal life. At the end of his career, Glenn Gould, the legendary keyboard interpreter of Bach, possibly one of the greatest interpreters of Bach's, turned to making tape collages of found sounds. And he came from Bach, which was, extremely rigorous, rule-bound composition, to to what people said, were just strings of noise, of him crinkling paper bags in front of a microphone and recording the sounds in a diner while he ate breakfast. So I do invite the more orthodox Western musicians among you to consider that, that anything that arranges itself into a pattern can be regarded as music. I'm not telling you have to believe that, but if you are listening to what these instruments do, it may help the case about whether I'm genuinely insane or not. So, in the next sections, we will delve into each of the Electroniums individually. Thank you for enduring a lecture with no analog sounds to accompany it.